Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the owner and publisher of The Spectator Australia and The Spectator USA and The Spectator UK, Andrew Neil. Andrew, great to have you back. It's
good to be back. What a build-up. No pressure.
No pressure at all. Now,
Can I go now? Quit while I'm ahead.
Well, let's get to what is the difference between being you run political magazines in America, in Australia, in Britain. What's the difference between being a political commentator and a political journalist for you?
Well, for me, as involved in print, I'm involved in opinion and commentary and so on. As a broadcaster, I try to be impartial. I leave my opinions at the studio door, and I take on all comers. If you're on the right, I will take a position on the left to test what you're saying. If you're on the left, I'll take a position on the right to test what you say. I mean, I deal with people who want to run the country. This country, America, Britain, France, and so on. So if I take a simple view, if you want to run the country, people should know that you know what you're talking about. And quite often they don't. And that's why it's not for gotcha questions. It's not to embarrass them. It's to because they're going to be spending billions of pounds. They could take decisions of war and peace. So I think it's our job to hold them to account, to see a simple question, are you up to it?
Your research is impeccable, though. It is. I've seen you stump some very seasoned politicians. Boris Johnson was reduced to just a quivering mess.
Mind you, he wouldn't be interviewed again by me, so it was a kind of career-destroying moment.
He learnt his lesson. Who's been the most impressive? Who have you thought this person stands above the average?
Well, Margaret Thatcher was very difficult to interview because she never answered the question. I mean, she's not alone in that among politicians. She would turn up with the point she wanted to make, and no matter what you asked her, she would make the points. And she took a long time answering. I mean, politicians are very good at playing out, filibustering, as they call it in America. Just keep talking, play with a straight bat, and hope that you run out of time. Strangely, the most impressive person I interviewed was the Dalai Lama. And I'm probably about the least spiritual person you can imagine, but I was really impressed. You know, I went through with him what the Chinese had done to his country. They'd taken 3,000-year-old manuscripts, laid them out on the ground, and put a combine harvester over them. And I was angry as I was talking about this, but he wasn't. He had that generosity of spirit that he wanted to move on, a magnetic smile, and that impressed me.
James.
You know, we're talking about interviews. We've got a bit of a clip here of you talking to Jacob Rees-Mogg. Look at that.
But when you look at the whole picture, you then have to look at the increase, as I mentioned earlier, in the living wage, the reduction in the universal credit withdrawal, the £150 to help people. So there are a number of steps that are being taken.
But none of them stop the poorest suffering a real decline in their income.
Now, this is the sort of thing that I don't think we get enough of here in Australia, frankly. But tell us what is going on here with the current government in the UK and this incredible cost of living crisis, which we are now starting to catch the front bit of that wave of here.
Well, the Conservatives in Britain have been in power now for 13 years, and last year they began to fall apart. I mean, we went through 3 prime ministers, 4 finance ministers, and 4 budgets, all in the space of several months. And that was a sense, people got the sense that this government was past its sell-by date, and that it was really running out of purpose, running out of competence as well, running out of leaders, running out of people to put into the cabinet. Rishi
This
Sunak
sounds a little familiar. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know where he is. Probably Outer Mongolia, I think, is the similar problem. Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, has begun to change that a bit. He's rebuilding a reputation for competence. He's getting things done. He's still desperately short of talent. He's also helped, though, by Labour, in the sense that although Labour is well ahead in the polls now and must still be regarded as the favourites to form the next government, as things stand at the moment, nobody's gagging for Keir Starmer, the Labour leader. He's a kind of Albanese-type figure. He's centre-left, social democrat, used to be much more left, isn't so much now. No one's really frightened of him. But then, in a way, they were frightened of Jeremy Corbyn, or many years before, frightened of Michael Foot. But they're not desperate for him the way they were for Tony Blair in 1997. So that gives the Conservatives still an outside fighting chance.
Tell us about Aukus and the deal there from the British point of view. So Australia's now going to get subs with the help of Britain, plus also the US. So there's a kind of, we're going to get some subs earlier from the US and build them with the UK. What does this mean from the British point of view, and how did the British insert themselves into this process?
Much to the consternation of the French.
As always.
Which is always a little bit of good news when you can annoy the French, because their diesel submarines were decided to be not proper for the 21st century. I think the AUKUS deal is, in Australia, Britain and America, is seriously undervalued. It's enormous. It's probably the biggest defence deal of the 21st century so far. It results in Australia almost quite quickly getting the Virginia-class submarines from America, the nuclear-powered but not nuclear-armed, submarines ideally suited for an ocean the size of the Pacific, which is far, far bigger than the Atlantic, and then working with Britain to build the successor to Britain's Astute-class submarines, which are already world beaters, and the new ones will be even more world beaters. It also means an intermingling of our three countries. Australian crews will train on American and British boats, and then American and British crews will come and work on Australian boats as well. It really brings the country lot together, and it's a lot more than submarines. It is a recognition that Britain, Australia, America, other allies in the Pacific region, from Japan to South Korea and so on, need to stand together, need to counter the rise of China. And so it also involves massive investment in artificial intelligence, in robotics, and in digital technology, all to power the economies of the future. And I think it's a huge, and I'm delighted that Britain, which is a long way from the Pacific, yes, and not a superpower, is nevertheless going to play a major part. And that was enhanced by the fact that Britain is now joining the Pacific Free Trade Organization as well. I hope America comes into it too. And alone among European powers, Britain will play a role, not a massive role, but will play a role in the future of the Pacific with other democracies in a way that the Germans or the French or the Italians will not.
Rita.
I want to ask you about the political landscape in the UK. You mentioned Labor ahead in the polls. We saw Boris win in a landslide, and then
throw it away.
Throw it away in so many ways, but his green... He seemed to be captured by the Green movement in a way that surprised many. And what's happening in the energy sector in the UK, the number of people who are now effectively in energy poverty, tell us about that, because we seem to be following in your footsteps.
Well, the cost of energy, of household fuel bills, gas and electricity, was enormous because Britain depends hugely on gas. We didn't issue new licenses for gas fields in the North Sea, so we have to import it. Of course, when Russia invaded Ukraine, the price of gas went through the roof. It spiked in August of last year. It's coming down now, and that will be reflected in fuel bills to come. But it was eye-watering. The average family faced a fuel bill of around almost 5,000 Australian dollars a year. I mean, it's huge for the average. And, you know, unlike, you can put off buying a car, you can say, oh, that fridge will do for a while. But the two things you cannot do without are fuel and food. And these were the two things that really spiked. So the government had to intervene massively in subsidizing fuel bills, gave a price guarantee that they wouldn't go above $5,000. That was still pretty high for a lot of ordinary families, when putting food on the table was also difficult. So it's cost, on top of the cost of the pandemic, the cost of dealing with these fuel bills has been huge as well. As I say, that's beginning to soften. But what it's done is that although the politicians still talk the talk about net zero, they're not really walking the walk now, because they've seen the price that it costs. And in Britain, and I think it's true in this country too, you have the concerns of what I would call a bourgeois elite, or even a haute bourgeois, an upper middle class elite, who take decisions which they think are the right decisions for the future of the country, but they don't pay the price because they can afford the fuel bills. And I think too often ordinary families are paying the price for a particular ideology and a view, particularly on the left as well, that they take this, that doesn't take into account the inability of the ordinary family to be able to meet the bills.
James.
So we had Professor Ian Plimer on a little while ago, and he talked about how when you've got a consensus between both parties on something, you get bad policy. And is it going to take this whole energy crisis to finally break what we see here in Australia, which is where both sides accept net zero as a worthwhile goal, just, about the terms and how long you want to take to get there?
Well, as I look in from the outside with your energy policy, I think you're heading for some real trouble. I mean, I think you could be heading for brownouts and maybe even blackouts if you.
Well, that's what our regulators say.
But that's decisions that politicians will take these decisions and then have to go with the consequences of it. It is true that when there's a consensus that isn't even questioned, you do get bad policy. I think there is now more questioning going on. Not that people are becoming climate change deniers, but I think they're skeptical of some of the solutions. And when you do get politicians all saying the same thing, that's the time when journalists should be most on edge, should be most questioning. My problem is that most environmental journalists are basically activists with laptops. That I've often said to some, I don't understand why some media outlets pay why they pay these journalists. I mean, Greenpeace should pay this. And I think we just need to be a little bit more questioning of some of the things. Keep in mind that it's ordinary people, as my old mentor, The Economist, used to call them plain folk, which he meant in the nicest way, plain folk, the backbone of all our countries. They often meet the costs of stupid decisions by politicians. And I'm also very wary of politicians who set targets for years so far in the future that they'll be long gone.
Yes.
It's easy to set a target by 2050. There's not a single person I would vouch in either the British, the American, or the Australian cabinet who'll be in power by 2050. They'll be long gone. And I would much rather they set targets for a period in which we, the voters, can hold them accountable. You didn't make that. You made that, well done. You didn't make that. You were wrong to have that target, weren't you? That's holding them to account. 2050, I mean, even I might not be around by 2050. I intend to be, but I probably won't be.
I'm sure you will be, Andrew. I'm sure you will be. Just very, very quickly, if you were to have Anthony Albanese, what would be the question for him?
Why are so many questions about this massive constitutional change, the voice? Why did they remain unanswered? How can Australians take an informed decision when they don't know the answer to simple questions like who will choose the voice, what will its powers be, how much will it cost? Until you get answers to that, I don't know how you can take a decision.
Fantastic. That was, of course, Britain's greatest television interviewer, Andrew Neil.